St. Peter's Basilica in the Vatican City in Rome. The cathedral on St. Peter's Square is a magnificent edifice capped with larger-than-life statues of the apostles. It's the most impressive monument of the Renaissance, with colonnades reminiscent of the temples of antiquity. St. Peter's is the largest church in the world, yet its construction would have been impossible just a few generations before. No one had the knowledge of mathematics, physics, and structural engineering needed to plan and organize such a vast project. Then, in the mid-16th century, artists and scholars stepped onto the stage and managed to do things that had seemed impossible for the previous 1,000 years. Within just 4 generations, they accrued the knowledge necessary to carry out massive projects, such as St. Peter's. Europe was transformed under the influence of individuals like Michelangelo Buonarroti, men of extraordinary accomplishment and versatility who found ways to bring seemingly impossible ideas to life. Their achievements still resonate today. But how did they do it? What was the secret of an age when the world seemed to undergo a paradigm shift? The age of the Renaissance. The Renaissance was more than just the rebirth of antiquity. Men like Michelangelo created something new. They took the techniques and art of the ancient Greeks and Romans and developed them further.
You won't find a single artwork of the Renaissance that simply copies an ancient one. The crucial thing is that the Renaissance didn't just rediscover the critical spirit of the Greeks, for example. It didn't just grapple with the science and scholarship of antiquity. It developed everything further. It invented completely new things and toppled the ancient giants who had originally been its teachers.
Raphael's School of Athens glorified ancient thought. And Leonardo da Vinci's Mona Lisa. For more than 1,000 years, the skill of realistically capturing the three-dimensional world on a flat canvas had been forgotten. The Renaissance rediscovered perspective. It was a quantum leap for architecture, which took its inspiration from the symmetry of the great buildings of the ancient world. The art of building huge domed structures had fallen into oblivion in the Middle Ages and was rediscovered in the Renaissance. But the Renaissance didn't limit itself to art. The invention of double-entry bookkeeping also meant that men of business now knew what funds they had available. The surplus fortunes of the newly wealthy flowed into the pockets of the era's artists. It was like an investment program for scholars and artists. Never before had so much been invented or devised in such a short period of time. New mechanical machines were created. And the human machine was researched in increasing detail. The study of anatomy reached a peak. The first pocket-sized timepieces were invented. This also made it possible to track the orbits of planets and the movements of celestial bodies. As the heavens guided seafarers, adventurers discovered new trade routes. The known world tripled in size.
The collapse of Byzantium, its defeat by the West during the Fourth Crusade, and its subjugation by the Ottoman Empire all played a major role in the development of the Renaissance. Many scholars fled to Italy, taking manuscripts with them and trying to instill new values and ideas into a culture they still saw as barbaric. It gave an unprecedented boost to innovation.
Das war sozusagen ein Innovationsschub ungekannten Ausmaßes.
The libraries of Constantinople were replete with treasures of immeasurable worth, the collective knowledge of antiquity. As hundreds of scholars and artists fled the advance of the Ottoman Turks, they took valuable books with them. This exodus of scholars from Byzantium reintroduced ancient techniques to the West. Marble sculptures took on a realism, movement and vitality unknown in the Middle Ages. Ancient frescoes inspired painters. Long-forgotten engineering techniques triggered a wave of technical innovations. Ancient ideas about the movement of the heavenly bodies were taught once more. Science, especially mathematics and physics, experienced an unexpected revival after centuries of oblivion.
The
Europeans learned from several civilizations. They learned from the Greeks and Romans, the Arabs, the Byzantines, and also from the Indians. The Arabic numeral system we use today actually came from India. But they didn't just copy. They developed something new with what they had learned and disseminated these ideas through printing. There was an incredible flourishing of discussion and debate.
Florence in 1410, a city-state with a population of 50,000, the size of London, and bursting with self-confidence. The Italian city was like the Silicon Valley of the Renaissance, a fount of knowledge and a meeting place for artists and scholars. Filippo Brunelleschi rediscovered perspective, a technique largely forgotten since antiquity. It was a geometrical system that made it possible to depict three-dimensional views realistically. Using it, he managed to put the building plans down on paper and render them visually comprehensible. It was the dawn of modern architecture. Perspective drawing also inspired painters, and their works took on a new realism. Artists took viewers on a journey to new worlds, and Renaissance paintings became more realistic than ever before. The rediscovery of perspective drawing was a powerful engine of progress. Donatello quite possibly dissected corpses too, as did Albrecht Dürer, Michelangelo, and Leonardo da Vinci 1 or 2 generations later. But even in Donatello's time, in the early Renaissance, artists were very familiar with the structure of the human body, which allowed them to create new, very lifelike depictions of people. Men like Donatello were either artistically talented scholars or scholarly artists.
The explosive thing about the Renaissance was that people became aware of their abilities and strengths in a new way. They unleashed an incredible energy in their thinking and actions, in business and technology. There was an outpouring of self-confidence.
In
the Middle Ages, nearly everyone was illiterate. The few who could read and write were from wealthier families or men and women of the church. The people who made or owned books looked after them like treasures. A copyist might only produce 10 to 15 volumes in an entire lifetime, which made the books incredibly valuable. But that was about to change.
To obtain a lovely codex, such as a Bible, for example, you would have to slaughter an entire flock of sheep, and that was expensive. But suddenly, books could be had for little money, and reading became democratic. Knowledge became accessible to larger numbers of people. More and more people were able to participate in scholarly discussions about new ideas. That's the only way we can explain how Europe became the continent of innovation, more so than any other.
Als jeder andere Kontinent, als jedes andere Fleckchen Erde.
The scribes of the church hadn't just copied works, they had also changed them and falsified sources, claiming their interpretation as the word of God. That gave them great power. But the Renaissance broke their monopoly on knowledge, one of the most important bastions of the church.
An awareness of sources and the truth grew, not least because these sources were now accessible. People started analyzing them using classical techniques, techniques used in antiquity. The traditional myths propagated by the church simply weren't accepted anymore.
Mainz, 1450. Printer Johannes Gutenberg's invention may have been the most significant one in 1,000 years, and yet we don't know what he looked like. His achievement was to combine existing methods of reproduction and printing into a single system. The handheld cast was the key to his printing press. It allowed letters to be cast individually, more quickly, and with greater precision. This marked the invention of modern printing. It was also the dawn of mass communication. Information became more widely available, opening the door to new opinions and perspectives. Information also became valued in new ways, as the printed word took precedence over oral traditions.
Printing was of truly enormous significance, and Gutenberg is the person who did the most important thing in 1,000 years of world history. Reading became increasingly widespread. The great scientific innovations and the great religious revolution, the Reformation, wouldn't have been possible without printing.
The first 60 years after the invention of printing saw the publication of 400 different vernacular editions of the Bible. At the same time, the number of lay people who could read and write grew. More and more people now had direct and immediate access to biblical texts, to the Word of God.
The people of the Renaissance felt close to God. They felt they were becoming godlike themselves. They wouldn't have said that in the Middle Ages. It would have been considered blasphemous. People referred to the Bible and called themselves God's creations. God made us in His image. We're almost gods in miniature. God came closer to people in the Renaissance than He ever was in the Middle Ages.
But it wasn't books that made up the bulk of the printing shop's business. It was fly sheets and pamphlets. They were affordable and cost a laborer 2 or 3 hours' pay. Now even ordinary people could print a pamphlet and disseminate their opinions, verses, and drawings. 3 subjects dominated: sensations and miracles, religious instruction, and political and military propaganda. Illustrated fly sheets also carried the first caricatures. They could be an invitation, an opinion, or a warning. Just like today's social media networks, they served as a vehicle for the mass dissemination of opinion.
Zur Renaissance gehören Flugblätter.
The Renaissance had fly sheets. It had literature that was printed and spread very quickly. It could be printed in Nuremberg tomorrow, and in 2 days' time would be in Zurich. Information disseminated more quickly and was much harder to control, too. The censorship of the church that dictated what was right didn't work anymore once the fly sheets began circulating. You can only understand the huge boom in free thinking in the Renaissance if you look at the media, and the fly sheets in particular.
Mass communication helped create that new type of individual, the celebrity.